Hello, I'm Conor Meade, and we're here today at the 2015 Canadian Science Policy Conference. And joining me right now is Dr. Katie Gibbs, who is a scientist, organizer, and advocate for science and evidence-based policies, and also the Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gibbs.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start off, could you tell us a little bit about the history of Evidence for Democracy and the story of how it came to be?
Sure, I'll try to give you the condensed version. So when I was finishing up my PhD at the University of Ottawa in 2012, myself and a bunch of other grad students and professors got together to organize a big science protest called the Death of Evidence Rally. And so this was in response to the government's omnibus budget bill that they had just introduced that cut a lot of science funding. And so we organized this large sort of science rally that ended up being a much bigger thing than any of us had expected it to be. And so from there, it just sort of seemed like there was enough interest and momentum from the science community to actually form a new organization that was promoting science, and not just, science in terms of science funding, but the role of science in government, in our democracy, in our society. And I was, sort of wrapping up my PhD and knew I didn't want a traditional science career, so it seemed like a fun challenge to try to start this organization. So I did.
Excellent. Well, Evidence for Democracy has definitely become a very credible voice in science policy. And you just hosted an absolutely fascinating panel on science advice to government. And I think my impression, at least, was that it was a very refreshing deep dive into some of the more complex policy issues around creating new mechanisms for providing science advice to government. So I wonder if you could give us a brief overview of what you feel are some of the more important questions that need to be answered as we design new mechanisms to ensure that science gets a voice within government.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when we put the proposal forward for the session, it was more of a theoretical topic of, what should Canada have? What could this look like? What can we learn from other countries? And then, of course, we're now post-election where the Liberals got elected, and one of the things that they put forward in their platform was to create a chief science officer position. So that sort of shifted the focus of the panel to be a little bit more targeted on this chief science officer position, and sort of trying to look at, what exactly should the mandate of that position be. If we look so far at what the Liberals have said, there's a few things like ensuring that government science is made available to the public, ensuring that government scientists can speak openly, and making sure that government decisions use evidence. And those are all really, three really important functions, but, part of it is when you look at what other countries have, it's been really important to sort of separate out an advisory function and an oversight function. So on one hand, it's, a chief science officer could, be delivering science advice, to the Prime Minister or to Parliament, but then this other oversight role is sort of more independent from government and sort of overseeing what they do and assessing them. And, we're really just trying to get some clarity on what, which of those two buckets this position should fill, and, what other roles are needed that, we might still need other institutions in the future to fill.
Absolutely. So obviously the mandate for Evidence for Democracy is probably a bit up in the air right now. What do you see as the future of the organization, and what are some of your goals going forward?
Yeah. Well, the mandate, I think, is still, is still the same. We're all about, trying to make sure that governments make transparent, evidence-based decisions, trying to make sure that the public as a whole has a better, understanding and appreciation for science and the role it plays, and making sure that we have a really engaged science community that is, actively participating in these things. So I think those broad mandates don't change. Our specific campaigns certainly will. Right now, when we're in this sort of critical post-election window, we're still focusing a lot on the federal government. We have a much, better relationship with the current government than we did the past. So we're hoping to use that by doing things like putting forward policy briefings. So for example, we will be taking this information from the panel today and be putting together a policy briefing on what we think the mandate of the Chief Science Officer position should be. And I think one thing that's really interesting and unique about Evidence for Democracy is that we're one of the few ways in which the scientific community as a whole and as individuals can really have a say in this kind of a work that we do in actually sort of getting some of this advice and input into government. So we also recently did a survey of the scientists in our network, trying to see what their main, what their top priorities and concerns were for science, and then we're collating that information and going to be putting that to the government as well.
Okay.
And then the longer term, we're actually taking this time to take a bit of a step back and are doing our very first strategic planning process, which is really exciting. And so there's always been a lot of other things that we wanted to focus on, not just the sort of federal political stuff, like doing more education to the public. Like we would love to, get in schools and start working on some curriculum to make sure that kids aren't just learning sort of science as a body of facts, but that they're actually learning the process of science and thinking like a scientist. So, because of the climate for the past few years, we've sort of been forced to really focus on the political work, but there's a lot of other, sort of more education and research type work that we would love to do. And so we're kind of excited to hopefully have the opportunity now to focus on that work as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So a final question before we wrap up. For the benefit of our viewers, many of whom I'm sure would love to learn more about Evidence for Democracy and maybe even get involved, as a two-part question, what sort of people would you love to be in touch with and who could contribute to Evidence for Democracy, and where can they find you online?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're at evidencefordemocracy.ca. Easy to find, and there are so many ways that people can get involved. So sort of the easiest is just sign up for our newsletter so that you're in the loop on what we're doing. But we also have an actual network of experts. And so this is our, actual network of scientists and researchers and experts across fields. It's a lot of government scientists, academic scientists, from a huge range of disciplines, and so they're really crucial in influencing our work. So we do a lot with them. Often we get media requests for scientists, so we would sort of direct them to our network. We often help experts in our network file op-eds, for example. We would help them sort of edit their op-ed and help them pitch it. So it's sort of it benefits us and them in that they sort of help influence our work, and then we also help them sort of increase their communication and media skills. And then we also have volunteers, and we have an absolutely incredible network of volunteers, ranging from non-scientists who just love science, all the way up to grad students, postgrads, and active scientists. And so there's always a way to get involved in our work.
Excellent. Well, we'll be sure to include a link to Evidence for Democracy in the description to this video.
Excellent.
And once again, thank you so much for joining me for this very informative interview, and thank you also for organizing that amazing panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Cheers.
Thanks.